Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'd also like to thank Professor Perry and the Harvard-Yenching Institute for having me here today for this wonderful event. It's such a great honor. And the Yenching Institute was a very generous supporter of my graduate student studies when I was here in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. So it's really a really great personal honor for me to be back here today. And today I will be speaking about Japanese civil society and its history of democratization. And the conventional wisdom regarding Japan's, the history of Japan's democracy, if you will, is that it was really democratized from above. And specifically, this is in reference to the US occupation reforms, which took place between 1945 and 52. And I think what is often overlooked is the role that Japan's civil society has played in the broader process of democratization, if you will, in pre-war democratizing reforms, as well as post-war democratic consolidation. So those will be the issues that I'll be going through today, and at the very end, I will also like to touch on a more contemporary issue, perhaps the relationship between contemporary Japanese civil society and nationalism. So just to start us off, I'd like to start off by giving the basic legal framework regarding Japan's civil society in the pre-war era. And this is the Meiji Constitution of 1889, and particularly Article 29, which reads, as you see here, Japanese subjects shall, within the limits of law, enjoy the liberty of speech, writing, publication, public meetings, and associations. And as you can see, this is a clause that gives very large discretion to the Japanese state to restrict these various liberties that are so fundamental to the functioning of a civil society. And it is also a kind of clause that is perhaps typical of a developmental state, which tries to prioritize civic duties over rights for the task of late development. But at the same time, it's important to note that the Japanese state exercised this discretion to varying degrees at various points in time, even in the pre-war period. So we do see the emergence of various modern civic organizations throughout the pre-war period. Chorus groups, bird-watching societies, the groups that really Robert Putnam speaks of, and as well as democratization movements. And two of them are worth mentioning here. The Jiyu Minken Undo, the movement advocating the founding of Japan's legislature. Of course, as we know, the 1868 Meiji Restoration, the founding of Japan's modern state, did not introduce a popularly elected legislature. So immediately following the founding of the Japanese, the modern state, we see the emergence of a movement that tries to push for the founding of a popularly elected legislature. And this bears fruit, as we know, in 1890, in the form of a popularly elected parliament. Of course, the movement was not the only factor that, or the only factor that really led to the founding of the parliament, but it certainly was one of those factors. But of course, in the early stages of the parliament, suffrage was certainly quite limited. Shortly after the founding of the parliament, we see the emergence of the universal suffrage movement that Professor Perry alluded to earlier as well. This movement bears fruit in the form of universal male suffrage in 1925. The picture here shows a rally that is going on to advocate for universal suffrage. Of course, as we know, female suffrage in Japan does not come until 1947 under the US occupation, but certainly male suffrage was in place in 1925. And of course, this is not to say that Japan was in any way a full-fledged democracy by this time. This was only a partial democracy. And also this is not to deny, as Professor Perry alluded to earlier, that after the late 1920s, civil society actually turns into an anti-democratic force and begins to call for de-democratization, if you will. democratization really does not occur until, or full democratization does not occur until the US occupation arrives. So jumping now to the post-war era, we have a new legal framework. The new constitution that is introduced and comes into effect in 1947. Article 21 reads, as you see here, the freedom of assembly and association, as well as speech, press, and all other forms of expression are guaranteed. No censorship shall be maintained, nor shall the secrecy of any means of communication be violated. So as you can see, this is a much more liberal wording compared to the Meiji Constitution. And as we may expect, in fact, we see a flourishing of all sorts of civil society, civic groups in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And this was actually the topic of my dissertation that I wrote here at Harvard about 10 years ago, was this very flourishing of civil society in the wake of World War II. And just to give you sort of a glimpse of this, I have here two graphs. The left-hand side, we see a number of new members in the Japan Alpine Club. The Japan Alpine Club is the oldest legally incorporated recreational organization in Japan. And as you can see, there is, whoops, I'm sorry. We see a huge spike in numbers of new members just after World War II. And when you read the documents for this group from this era, you really see that the staff are being completely flooded by application materials arriving in the mail every day and being completely pushed to the limits to try to process all of these applications. Another example is the YMCA Japan, and unfortunately a lot of the membership figures are missing for many of the years. A lot of the documents for the YMCA were destroyed during the wartime, but nevertheless the general overall trend is quite similar to the Alpine Club. The y-axis is number of total numbers of members rather than new members, but as with the Alpine Club, we see a very rapid surge, if you will, in numbers of members after World War II. And I would argue that this flourishing, this bursting of civic activities in the wake of World War II really helped to consolidate Japan's new democracy in the wake of World War II. And this, I would argue, happened in quite a few different ways, but perhaps the most important way in this occurred may have been by giving a voice or serving as a channel for various interests that were left out of Japan's rapid economic growth, which begins in the early 1950s. So, for instance, we have various fisheries interests, farming interests, and so forth, which begin to actively lobby the Japanese government for redistribution of the fruits of that growth, which are occurring primarily in the cities. And these interests are quite successful, in fact, in winning redistribution from the cities back to the countryside. And as Samuel Huntington tells us, growing income inequalities are highly fatal to the fate of a new democracy. And the fact that these interests were able to win back some of the fruits of the high-speed economic growth during wartime, I would argue, helped to legitimate the Japanese state and to consolidate the new democratic system. And the bullet train here is sort of symbolic of that redistribution from the cities to the countryside. A similar story with environmental protests. After the 1950s, we see the emergence and growth of various environmental protests in Japan. And the picture here shown here is one of the Minamata disease victims demanding compensation for their suffering. After the early 1970s, the Minamata protesters begin to win a series of important court cases that then usher in much more stringent environmental regulations on the one hand, as well as compensation from the government and various companies towards the victims. And this, again, is an illustration, I think, of how the civil society gave voice to various interests that were left out of the high-speed growth, if you will, and again, helping to consolidate Japan's democracy. Now, since the 1980s, the focus of Japan's civil society has shifted from the national level to the local level. And this is a phenomenon that political scientist Robert Pekkanen has termed members without advocates. And he is mainly referring to Japan's civil society in comparison with American civil society. But he characterizes Japan's civil society since the 80s as one in which small, local level, and service-oriented organizations become predominant. And national level advocacy, from the national level advocacy largely declines. And from what I understand, on the basis of my limited knowledge of Korean civil society, this comparison also holds up against Korea as well, where national level advocacy is very, very much active. In Japan, advocacy shifted to the local level. And where they actually have been having quite a bit of success. And this is a pattern that we see over and over again, with civil society pushing for policy innovations at the local level. And then that policy reform diffusing across different local governments in Japan, and then eventually working itself up to the national level as well. So for instance, one example is freedom of information. Civil society groups began pushing for freedom of information ordinances, and the first of which are adopted in Japan by local governments in the early 1980s. And thereafter, these freedom of information clauses spread to other local governments throughout Japan, and then in the mid-1990s, it is finally adopted in the form of a Freedom of Information Act at the national level. And this is also a pattern that we see with environmental impact assessment as well. And finally, I would like to just briefly touch on the more recent trend of national civil society, or whether it is in fact emerging, and to what extent. And to borrow Robert Pekkanen's phrase, the way in which I might describe civil society, nationalistic civil society groups in Japan, may be advocates without members. And in the sense that these groups tend to be more elite-based organizations that at present have been able to mobilize tremendously large numbers of members. And the most typical of this, I think, is the conservative history textbook movement, which emerged in the late 1990s. And of course, as we know, this was the very controversial revisionist view of history that these people were trying to put forth. And however, the movement was comprised strictly as an elite group. It was comprised of revisionist historians, policy people, journalists, and so forth. But the lack of its mass basis is manifested in the fact that after more than 10 years, this highly controversial textbook has been adopted by less than 2% of all schools in Japan. So these groups have had a lot of trouble mobilizing broader support. And in the mid-2000s, actually, this group got into so much internal infighting that the group has all but disbanded and disappeared. The Zaitokukai movement, this is the hate speech movement that much has been made of in the press. This, compared to the textbook movement, this is a group that has a bit more of a mass basis than the textbook movement. However, the membership still is not very large. At the end of 2013, they claimed to have a membership of about 14,000, but since then it has been reported that the membership has been declining very rapidly, especially after they lost a major court case last month in the Kyoto District Court for harassing the Korean schools in Kyoto. So this, it appears that this movement is on the wane as well, although I may be possibly a bit optimistic on this. The other interesting side of this Zaitokukai movement, I would argue, is the rise of counter movements that have emerged out to oppose this movement. The most famous of which is the CRAC, a group called CRAC, called Counter Racist Action Collective. And so these groups have been quite successful in many instances in mobilizing counter demonstrations against the Zaitokukai hate speech demonstrations. So I would argue that while the emergence of these nationalistic right-wing groups is disturbing and they should be watched carefully, it is also important to keep in mind that their mass basis thus far has been quite limited, and that they have had a lot of trouble in mobilizing broader support. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.